Welcome back. And in this session, we are going to go under the hood with the concept of inequality. You may recall that when we spoke about the Sustainable Development Goals, we indicated that the recognition that inequality is a brake on development was very different to what lived in the Millennium Development Goals, where they only spoke about poverty reduction without referencing inequality. So what we will do is, since it's such an important advance in policy thinking, we will use this session to really connect the centrality of informal ways of living and economic activity in African cities with the concept of inequality. We can't solve Africa's urban challenges unless we are crystal clear about how these forces connect. The first point to make is that, of course, we now know that informality is the dominant character of African cities. Most urban dwellers have informal jobs that are precarious, low wage, and that means that people are always hustling. Secondly, because they have informal jobs with low wages, they cannot afford to live in a formal suburban house. They simply don't have the resources to cover all of the costs associated with that. So, unsurprisingly, they tend to live in what we call slums or informal areas because it means they can manage their hustle more effectively. Of course, the job of the state is to make sure that that condition is as humane and as livable as possible, and people are able to access opportunities to transform their livelihoods. What is important today is to recognize that at the urban scale, dealing with the problem of informal jobs and informal living, or as the sociologists would say, the context within which social reproduction happens as opposed to economic reproduction, that's just a fancy way of saying where people live and what they do to keep their families and their livelihoods together, that dealing with these things requires us to think about how that is part of a larger story of inequality. So what I'm going to do in this session is to break open this concept of inequality, because often we tend to think it is just about incomes. And in fact, when you read reports or you listen to politicians, they would always speak about the Gini coefficient. This is a measure of income inequality, but actually the story is much bigger, as we will see in the rest of this session. So indeed, income inequality is at the heart of economic inequality. But the way that you participate in the labor market, whether you've got access or not, is another form of inequality. So we call that labor market inequality. What might be the most important dimension of economic inequality is, in fact, the amount of wealth and access to assets that you have. So an asset could be a building, a piece of land, a car that's already paid off, a piece of art potentially. And as you can imagine, that in most of our cities, in most of our countries, there's a very small proportion of the population that have access to wealth and assets. And that's another form of inequality. So it's very important to understand, yes, income is key, but it connects with access to the labor market, wealth and assets. Now then there's another universe of inequality. In other words, people have access to these things in very different ways in cities. Education. And I'm sure in the city where you live, you know what are the really bad under-resourced schools and what are the really good schools. And you know that people who live in very poor areas often can't even access educational opportunities. The same applies to health. The same applies to access to nutritional food. And sadly, in many of our cities and towns, it also applies to safety. We know, for example, in the case of South Africa, that if you live in a township or in an informal settlement, the risk of being exposed to violent crime is much greater than if you live in a suburb or you live in a tourist hotspot of the city. Now, these parts of the inequality picture is connected to another form of inequality, which is infrastructural inequality. In other words, we will observe statistically differential access to energy, to water, to sanitation, to waste, transport and mobility, and things that go to the heart of well-being, which is public and green space. Not everyone has access to these things in an equal way, and that affects the ability to perform well in your educational context. It affects your ability whether you can access nutritional food or not. It affects whether you feel safe or not. Now, what is interesting is that these are material and financial things. But fascinatingly, what we know is that in societies where people don't exercise their political rights to voice, they don't exercise their political rights to claim what is entitled to them, inequality tends to be higher. But we also know that often whether people feel culturally seen and whether they feel confident enough to claim their cultural rights affects whether they in fact exercise political rights. So what you see from this diagram is this integrated, tightly knotted story of inequality. And it is a profound error to only focus on income inequality. We have to understand it in its multidimensionality. Final point to make. Where you live really matters. So we've built a final concept, which is spatial inequality. And this helps us to understand that space, where people live, how they move, that this can reinforce the connections between these different dimensions of inequality, but it can also speak to the intensity of the depth of these various bases of inequality. And so, from a policy point of view, addressing spatial inequality becomes the most powerful lever to tackle and reverse multidimensional inequality. I hope that that has broadened your understanding of a word that you hear all the time, that rolls off the tongue of politicians and other people with great ease, and that cleverly often is only equated with income. But actually, it's a much more complicated story, and most importantly, it's a spatial story, so it really matters to us who try and understand cities and how to transform them.